So many of you have seen this build right here, Portal. It's the custom loop that I did in NZXT's new H510 Elite. There were a lot of things that just did not go to plan with this build, and I'll be sharing all of those things today. You guys had a lot of great questions about how I did certain things and also the thermals, so that's what we're going to be diving into this video. Let's start with all of the hardware inside, starting with the CPU, which is AMD's new Ryzen 3900X. I've tested this CPU pretty extensively at this point, so if you're interested in benchmarks versus the 9900K, for example, feel free to go back and check those out. At least for now, this is the highest core count CPU that can be thrown into a mainstream desktop socket, wielding 12 cores and 24 threads at an all-core boost clock of around 4.2 GHz. Cooling the CPU is EK's Velocity RGB water block, and I actually wasn't planning on using the RGB at all, but I was really surprised with how nice and saturated the RGB lighting looked. The motherboard that I've got installed in there is Gigabyte's X570 Aorus Extreme. This board has been an absolute pleasure to work with for the majority of my Ryzen 3000 testing and looks so unbelievably clean as well. We have actual heat sinks here for the VRM, which is nice, and thankfully no chipset fan making additional noise or potential point of failure. Instead, we see a heat pipe connecting it to the main VRM heatsink. Now this motherboard is eATX, and many of you pointed out that this case doesn't natively support eATX motherboards, but you can actually squeeze an eATX motherboard in there. The only two things that you'll need to do really are, firstly, remove the rear fan so that it can slide in there, and then to sort of slide it in on an angle behind the cable management cover. That way you can comfortably fit an eATX board in there. The other sort of caveat with doing that is that your connectors on the right side of the board, like your motherboard 24-pin cable and chassis fan headers, for example, are going to be an absolute pain in the butt to connect. I think it took me about 30 minutes just to plug in a couple of connectors on the right side of the board, because they are pretty well hidden by that cable management bar cover on the interior, and they are extremely hard to reach. For storage, I threw in two of Gigabyte's PCIe Gen 4 NVMe drives. The primary drive is a 2TB drive, and I've got an additional 1TB in the second slot, so all in all, quite a lot of ultra-fast storage. A few of you asked about the memory that I'm using here, and this is actually the same 32GB kit of CL14 3200MHz memory that I use on my open test bench, but I did sand the black paint and text off of the heat spreaders. This took a lot longer than I thought it would and required a ton of effort, but the finished result looks totally worth it, and it complements the clean design of the motherboard really well. And of course, for a build of this caliber, we are going with the RTX 2080 Ti, and that's being cooled by EK's RTX Vector Block. Installation there was pretty simple and straightforward. They illustrate clearly which thermal pads go where online and the width required for each pad, so that was definitely appreciated. Backplate on there is also from EK with a super clean mirror finish. I'll link the specific one down below in the description. The power supply that I'm using is the 1000 watt straight power 11 from Be Quiet that I custom sleeved quite recently. Plenty of power for the 3900X and 2080 Ti, and the fan barely spins at all. Cable management was also okay, certainly nothing terrible, but nothing to brag about either. The last and most critical piece of this custom water cooling loop is of course the case, and when I saw the NZXT H510 Elite at Computex this year, I just knew that this is going to be the next case for my mid-tower custom loop. It's not like this case is special for radiator mounting or specifically built for water cooling at all. In fact, we'll talk more about that in the end, but it's just the minimal boxy design that really got my attention. Now let's talk about the reservoir. So I wanted to try and make things a little interesting here instead of just going with your run-of-the-mill cylinder reservoir that we see in all custom water-cooled builds these days. And so the Glacier R160 from Fantex was the perfect alternative. It's small, it looks clean, intriguing, and you can install a DDC pump directly at the bottom, for which I am using a PWM model from Swiftech. I also love that you have a few options in terms of inlet and outlet ports, so that gives you some flexibility with mounting as well. And speaking of the mounting, I did make a custom 45-degree bracket here, which allows me to mount the reservoir straight into the power supply shroud. Also, the bracket doesn't need to be screwed into the reservoir at all, as I modeled it to slide snugly into the grill grill on the back. Printing this model took a little over 6 hours at an infill percentage of 20% and a layer resolution of 0.2 millimeters. I will leave the 3D model link down below for you guys if you want to print it as well. Funnily enough, this is not how I actually planned this build to look. I actually planned to use the mounting bracket on the cable management sort of mounting bar at the back there. As you can see, it's got a little rail that you can mount pumps and reservoirs to. That was the initial plan for this bracket, but it didn't actually turn out how I had planned. It turns out that the RTX 2080 Ti water block is quite long, and so even if I mounted the GPU block vertically, it was still interfering with mounting that reservoir at the back. So this was really the only option in the end, and actually I'm glad that it was because I am ecstatic with how it looks. Now, one of the biggest roadblocks that I encountered for this build, which almost delayed it for up to a few more days, was actually the radiator mounting. And although I love the cleanliness and boxy minimal design of the H510 Elite, I'm sorry NZXT, but the radiator mounting for this case gave me an absolute headache. It's trash if I'm honest. For an Elite enclosure, this is definitely not what I expected in terms of custom water cooling support. The fact that a 280mm radiator was such a struggle to fit into this case, it almost made me just not use this case, if I'm honest. If you're just using a 280mm AIO, that will fit in here, no problem. But if you are planning to do a custom loop with a 280mm radiator, most of them will not fit. So make sure you pick one that isn't too tall. The one that I've got in there is the EK Coolstream SE, which is not a thick radiator or anything like that. It's just a little bit too tall. So make sure you double check the dimensions of the radiator that you're going to be using if you do plan on using an aftermarket one for a custom loop. The only way that I actually got this radiator into this case was by drilling into the radiator mounting bracket. So that was definitely not ideal, but it is something that I had to do to get this build finished. Now, the RGB illumination possibilities for this build are virtually endless. The RGB Air 2 fans in particular offer some really interesting looking effects and color schemes. In the end, I just stuck with white on the fans and a light blue on the water blocks. I feel like this gives a really nice clean look. Also, the coolant that I used for this build is EK's cryofuel. Here it is right here. It's the solid cloud white premix, so it's an opaque coolant. Let me know if you guys want me to do a follow-up in a few weeks or so when I tear down the build, because as we know, opaque coolants are not usually the most reliable when it comes to keeping the loop nice and healthy. They do tend to clog up the fin stack on the water blocks quite frequently. So let me know if you guys want me to do a follow-up with this when it comes time to tear down the build. I'd be more than happy to do that. Okay, onto thermals now, starting with the CPU. Things are looking pretty average. This is around equal to what you can expect with a 280mm AIO based off of my previous testing. Do note that this is with everything set to auto in the BIOS, and with the latest BIOS update, I'm actually seeing the CPU voltage being set unusually high. Around 1.28 to 1.3 volt is where I would typically see the 3900X sit at full load, and here we're seeing that quite a bit higher at as much as 1.36 to 1.38. Also, I don't think that you'd see a strong improvement in thermals upgrading to a 360mm radiator or a dual radiator configuration, at least for the CPU, as we can see that the CPU temp does raise quite quickly, and that's not due to the 280mm radiator being saturated. If that were the case, we would see the CPU temperature gradually increase a lot more over time. When we remove the front panel, the CPU temp does improve by around 9 degrees C, which is significant, leading us to conclude the H510 Elite's front panel is pretty restrictive for airflow. But this is not the cause of the unusually high CPU temps for the custom loop. That I blame on the higher than normal V-core of 1.38 volts. In fact, even when just sitting at the desktop at idle, we're not seeing true idle temperatures and voltages. Instead, the 3900X is being fed up to 1.5 volts, and yes, this is with the latest public BIOS for this board. Things get a little weirder though. It's when we simulate a gaming benchmark like Heaven 4.0 that the CPU temps and V-core get even more sporadic, with the CPU almost touching 90 degrees C. The 2080 Ti is going okay, maybe a little bit warmer than expected, topping out at 62 degrees C, with the 3900X doing its share of warming up the loop and radiator. This is about what you would expect. So I'm definitely happy with the finished look of the build, and I feel like I've gained a lot more experience in the area of custom water cooling after building this. I experimented with different fitting angles and a completely different look for this one, and I honestly feel like it's the best looking PC that I've ever built. Having said that, and it pains me to say this, it really does, because the build just looks so good. Maybe you guys could use some other parts, for example, but I just don't recommend you do the same thing with the same parts, because there are a few things going wrong here, as we saw. First up is the case, and I know it looks amazing, right? But the radiator options and the sort of custom water cooling support are just not there for an Elite enclosure. You guys would be much better off building in the Lee & Lee 011 or even Fractal Designs Define S2. In those cases, you can do up to a triple radiator configuration. So if you are serious about cooling, then that's probably what I would go for first. The CPU and motherboard issues are something separate entirely, and it frustrates me because even after 2 months after the 3rd gen Ryzen launch, we're still having these issues with the boost, the V-core, and the temperature behavior, where it's just not what you would expect. Getting the CPU thermals to where they should be would require manual tuning, so lowering the load line calibration in the BIOS, or for example, setting a fixed frequency and voltage. That would get the CPU V-core under control, but it's not something that should need to be done, especially after investing this much money into one of the top of the line boards and a custom water cooling system. Next up for custom water cooling projects will actually be my primary gaming and editing system right here in the Ghost S1, which I am super excited about. So as always guys, a huge thanks for watching. Consider subscribing down below if you haven't already, and I will see you all in the next one.